The colony of New Avalon was supposed to be a beacon of human progress, a thriving settlement on the edge of the galaxy. It had taken decades of effort, billions of credits, and the sacrifice of countless pioneers to establish. A symbol that humanity was no longer confined to the cradle of Earth. And then, in a single day, it was gone. The distress signal had been brief. A garbled message intercepted by a passing trade vessel before silence swallowed the colony whole. No survivors, no wreckage, just an empty, lifeless planet where a thriving city had once stood. The attackers had left nothing behind. No declaration, no warning, not even a name. They had simply erased New Avalon as if it had never existed. But humanity remembered. And humanity did not forgive. Admiral Jonathan Graves stood on the bridge of the UNS Retribution, staring at the tactical display in front of him. It was a monstrous sight, a fleet unlike anything in human history, assembled for one single purpose: revenge. 700,000 warships, the combined might of every Terran fleet, every colonial navy, every mercenary outfit willing to take up arms. From the smallest corvette to the behemoth dreadnoughts, the fleet was an unstoppable armada that stretched across the void like an angry storm. For the first time, humanity was united, not for politics, not for trade, not even for survival, for vengeance. ETA to enemy system? Graves asked. 4 days, Admiral. His XO, Commander Vasquez, turned to him with a grim nod. Scout drones confirmed their presence. We know who did it. Graves exhaled sharply. Who? Vasquez's jaw tightened. They call themselves the Zorvax Dominion, some kind of ancient warrior empire. We weren't even on their radar before. They probably thought we were just another minor race, easy prey. A growl rumbled through the bridge crew. The Zorvax had made a fatal mistake. Graves turned to the massive viewport, gazing at the endless fleet surrounding his flagship. They thought wrong. The Zorvax were old. Their empire had existed for thousands of years, built on conquest and dominance. They had crushed dozens of species, burned hundreds of worlds, and fought wars before humanity had even discovered fire. But for the first time in millennia, they had made a miscalculation. The humans were not like the others. They did not cower. They did not beg. They brought war. 700,000 human warships arrived in Zorvax space in a wall of fire and steel. The first planetary defense stations barely had time to raise shields before nuclear hellfire reduced them to molten slag. Their fleets scrambled, commanders barking orders in panic. They had expected a skirmish, maybe a minor retaliatory raid. Instead, they were met with annihilation. Missiles streaked across the void in the millions. Kinetic slugs shattered battleships with ease. And when the human Marines landed, they did not take prisoners. One by one, the Zorvax colonies fell. The once proud Dominion, which had stood for thousands of years, began to crumble under the sheer, unrelenting force of human rage. There were no negotiations, no peace talks, only vengeance, and humanity was just getting started. The Zorvax High Council had never known fear. For centuries, they had ruled through terror, their warriors unmatched, their fleets unstoppable. But now, for the first time in their long, brutal history, they understood what it meant to be prey. Reports flooded in from across the Dominion. The humans had arrived in force. Their warships, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, moved with relentless efficiency, burning through every defensive line the Zorvax had thrown in their path. Planets that had stood under the Dominion's rule for millennia were now reduced to smoldering wastelands. On the bridge of the UNS Retribution, Admiral Graves listened to the latest battle reports. Sir, enemy stronghold on Varlock 7 neutralized. Resistance was heavier than expected, but ground forces secured the capital within 6 hours. Graves nodded. Casualties? The tactical officer hesitated. Minimal, sir. Less than 1,000 dead. 1,000 dead would have been a tragedy in any other war, but not this one. Not after what had happened to New Avalon. Graves turned his attention to the holographic map of Zorvak's space. In just 2 weeks, a third of their empire had been reduced to ruin. "Admiral," Vasquez said, her voice tight, "we've intercepted Zorvak's transmissions. They're calling for reinforcements from their core systems. They're preparing for a last stand." Graves allowed himself a grim smile. "Good," he said. "Let them come." On the Zorvak's homeworld of Cathara, Supreme Warlord Zolvir watched as his empire crumbled. The humans had moved faster than he thought possible. They did not just fight. They destroyed. Entire fleets wiped out in hours, fortress worlds reduced to ash. The humans had no interest in diplomacy, no hesitation, no mercy. A desperate council member spoke up. "We must surrender. Offer them whatever they want." Zolvir bared his fangs. "They do not want surrender." His voice was cold, final. "They want revenge." Another counselor shuddered. "Then what do we do?" The warlord closed his eyes. He had studied the humans, underestimated them. He had assumed them weak, as so many other empires had. But now, as their ships darkened his skies, he understood the truth. The humans were monsters, and there was no stopping them. The Zorvak's dominion was dying. Once, its fleets had ruled unchallenged, spreading across the galaxy like a plague, crushing species that dared to resist. But now, that same dominion burned. From the bridge of the UNS Retribution, Admiral Graves watched the unfolding battle over the Zorvak's homeworld, Cathara. The holographic display flickered as fleet movements updated in real time. The human armada had arrived in full force, hundreds of thousands of warships forming an unbreakable wall in space. The Zorvak's fleet was vast, but they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and worst of all, outmatched in sheer human fury. "Enemy forces engaging," Commander Vasquez reported. "They're throwing everything they have at us." Graves didn't blink. "And?" Vasquez's lips curled into a grim smirk. "They're dying fast." The battle was brutal, but the outcome had been decided long before the first shots were fired. The Zorvaks, for all their age and experience, had never faced anything like humanity before. Human warships didn't hold formation like the other species the Zorvaks had conquered. They didn't follow rigid tactics, didn't break under pressure. They adapted, they overwhelmed, and they fought with a kind of viciousness that terrified even the most seasoned Zorvak's warriors. Tactical nukes streaked through the void, detonating in the heart of enemy formations. Kinetic slugs, traveling at near-light speeds, punched through battleships, turning them into shredded wreckage. Swarms of fighter drones overwhelmed carriers, cutting through shields like razors. The Zorvaks fought desperately, their homeworld at stake, but it was not enough. "Admiral, the enemy flagship is in range," a lieutenant called out. Graves didn't hesitate. "Fire!" The Retribution's main cannon, a mass driver the size of a skyscraper, roared to life. A tungsten round the size of a shuttle was launched at near relativistic speeds, smashing into the Zorvak's command ship before its shields could react. The vessel disintegrated instantly. A cheer erupted from the bridge, but Graves remained unmoved. "Status on planetary defenses?" "Surface cannons are still active, sir," Vasquez said, "but they're losing power fast. Our bombardment is breaking them apart." Graves nodded. "Then we move to the next phase." On the surface of Cathara, Supreme Warlord Zolvir watched in horror as the sky turned to fire. Humanity's bombardment had begun. High above, the human fleet rained destruction upon his world. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were turned to rubble in seconds. Entire mountain ranges shattered under orbital strikes. The oceans boiled as warships unleashed their fury. The Zorvax had waged war for centuries, had committed genocide on dozens of species. They had believed themselves unstoppable. But now, as their own world was torn apart, they knew fear. A transmission flickered on the warlord's command screen. A human face appeared, Admiral Graves. His expression was unreadable. "This is what happens when you cross humanity," Graves said, his voice like cold steel. "You wiped out our colony. You thought you could erase us." He leaned closer to the screen. "Now, we erase you." Zolvir swallowed his pride. He had never begged before. But now he had no choice. "Human," he growled, lowering his head slightly. "We surrender." There was a long silence. Then Graves spoke. "No." The transmission cut out. A moment later, the sky split apart as the final bombardment began. Cathara burned. The war was over, and humanity had won. The war was over, but the rage still burned. Cathara had been reduced to a husk. Its once proud cities turned to mountains of ash and rubble. The oceans still boiled from orbital bombardments, and the air was thick with smoke and the scent of death. Fires raged across the shattered landscape, consuming the remains of a once great civilization. Admiral Graves stood in the command deck of the UNS Retribution, staring at the ruined world below. The Zorvax dominion had fallen. Their fleets were destroyed, their armies crushed, their people left broken. And yet, he felt no satisfaction. "They're sending surrender requests from across their remaining colonies," Commander Vasquez reported. "Every Zorvax world left standing is begging for terms." Graves exhaled slowly. He had known this would happen. The Zorvax had believed themselves invincible, but when faced with total annihilation, their will had shattered. The same species that had enslaved, massacred, and conquered countless others were now pleading for mercy. "They're offering reparations," Vasquez continued. "They're promising to disarm, to disband their empire completely." Graves said nothing for a long moment. Outside the viewport, the last human dropships were finishing their sweeps of Cathara. The ground war had been a slaughter. The Zorvax defenders had fought, but with no fleet to support them, it had been hopeless. Human marines had torn through their last bastions of resistance, executing every military leader they could find. "Their race deserves extinction," a voice growled behind him. Graves turned to see General Marcus O'Neill, the commander of the ground forces. His armor was still stained with Zorvax blood, his expression cold with fury. "They got what they deserved," Graves said evenly. "Did they?" O'Neill stepped forward. "One of their warriors told me something before I put a bullet in his skull. He said the Zorvax don't even have a word for surrender, that they've never lost a war." His lip curled. "Until now." Graves nodded. He had no pity for the Zorvax. They had brought this upon themselves. "What do we do now, Admiral?" Vasquez asked. Graves turned back to the viewport. The Zorvax homeworld was dying, but there were still survivors, civilians, families, those who had never held a weapon. The question was whether they deserved to live. For New Avalon, the answer should have been simple, but he hesitated. "Send a message to the fleet," he said at last. "The war is over. No more killing." Vasquez and O'Neill both stiffened in surprise. "You're letting them live?" O'Neill asked, his voice sharp. Graves turned, his expression hard. "We came for vengeance," he said. "We got it. Now we leave." O'Neill exhaled through his nose but didn't argue. Vasquez gave a small nod of understanding. "Order sent," she said. The fleet began to withdraw. The remaining Zorvax, those too weak to fight or too broken to resist, watched in stunned silence as the human armada vanished into the void. They had been defeated so completely that their very survival now depended on the mercy of the species they had once sought to erase. Humanity had won. But Graves knew that somewhere, sometime, another enemy would rise. And when they did, humanity would be ready. The Zorvak's dominion was no more. What remained of their civilization was little more than scattered ruins and broken survivors, their once mighty fleets reduced to drifting wreckage in the void. Across their former empire, human warships loomed like specters, ensuring that no remnants of their military would ever rise again. But even in defeat, the Zorvaks endured. Admiral Graves knew this war had not just been about revenge. It had been about making a statement. Humanity would never again be prey. And the galaxy had heard the message loud and clear. 6 months after the fall of Cathara, the echoes of war still rippled across the stars. Humanity had changed. The United Terran Directorate had become something different, stronger, more unified, but also more feared. The sight of a Terran warship was now enough to make entire planets reconsider their allegiances. Diplomats from every corner of known space scrambled to establish treaties, alliances, or at least guarantees that they would never cross humanity. But there were those who whispered that humanity had become something dangerous. The war had been justified. Every species that had suffered under Zorvak's rule had celebrated their fall. But there was an unspoken fear now. If humanity could destroy a millennia-old empire in mere months, what would they do to anyone who stood in their way? On Earth, the streets of every major city were filled with celebrations. Statues were erected to honor the fallen of New Avalon. Veterans of the war were hailed as heroes. Every broadcast, every news outlet, every speech made it clear. Humanity had won, and it had secured its place in the galaxy. But behind the victory parades, the war had left its scars. Graves had seen it in the soldiers who had fought on Cathara, the coldness in their eyes, the way they spoke of the Zorvaks as if they were not even sentient. The war had not just wiped out an empire, it had hardened humanity itself. And perhaps that was necessary. Standing in his office on the newly commissioned UNS Eternity, Graves studied a classified report. Intelligence had confirmed what he had already suspected. Not everyone in the galaxy had been terrified by humanity's war of vengeance. Some had been watching, calculating. A new power had begun to stir on the fringes of known space. An alliance of species, once rivals, now united by one thing: fear of humanity. They had seen what humanity was capable of, and they had decided they could not afford to wait. They were preparing for war. Graves closed the file. The Zorvaks had been the first, but they would not be the last, and if the galaxy wanted to test humanity again, it would burn just the same. The galaxy had not forgotten. 6 months after the fall of the Zorvak's dominion, humanity stood unmatched. Its fleets were the most feared in the known universe, its soldiers hardened by war. Every species that had once dismissed humanity as insignificant now watched them with wary eyes. But not all of them watched in silence. A storm was coming. Admiral Graves sat in the war room of the UNS Eternity, the new flagship of the United Terran Directorate. Around him, holographic projections displayed intelligence reports gathered from the edges of known space. The signs were unmistakable. "They call themselves the Accord of Sovereign Worlds," Vasquez reported, her voice clipped. 5 species, once enemies, now allied under one purpose, containing humanity. Graves exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the projection. The Accord wasn't just a political pact. It was an emergency coalition formed by species who had never trusted each other, who had fought wars against one another for centuries. Now, they had put aside their hatred, because they feared something more. They feared humanity. O'Neill, seated across the table, let out a low chuckle. 5 species banding together just to stop little old us? I'd say that's flattering. No, Graves said, voice steady. That's dangerous. The Zorvax had been powerful, but they had been alone. Isolated. Arrogant. The Accord was different. It was coordinated. Intelligent. And it had one goal: to make sure humanity never again wielded the kind of power it had used to wipe out the Zorvax. They're already moving, Vasquez continued. They've reinforced border systems, doubled their fleets. We intercepted communications confirming joint military exercises. They're preparing for war. Graves leaned back, his fingers steepled. The war with the Zorvax had been swift, brutal. But this? This would be something else entirely. He turned to O'Neill. What's the status of our forces? The general smirked. Stronger than ever. New Avalon's destruction woke something up in us, Admiral. Recruitment rates are at an all-time high. Every colony is churning out warships and weapons like their lives depend on it. His expression darkened. Because they do. Graves nodded. Humanity had won its war of vengeance, but the price had been transformation. They were no longer the species that had once sought peace among the stars. They were now something far more dangerous. We need to strike first, Vasquez said firmly. We can't let them box us in. Graves didn't answer immediately. He stared at the galactic map, the cold vastness of space filled with the colors of hostile factions. The Accord thought they could contain humanity, thought they could put a leash on the species that had just wiped an empire from existence. They were wrong. Slowly, Graves stood. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. Prepare the fleets. Vasquez and O'Neill exchanged a glance. We're going to war? O'Neill asked, though there was no hesitation in his voice. Graves's eyes were like steel. We never stopped. The galaxy had drawn its lines, and now humanity would teach them what it meant to cross them. The galaxy stood on the edge of war. The Accord of Sovereign Worlds had united 5 powerful species, sworn enemies now bound by a single cause, containing humanity before it became unstoppable. They reinforced their borders, mass-produced warships, and stockpiled weapons. They thought they could intimidate humanity into submission. They were wrong. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the UNS Eternity, humanity's most advanced warship, staring at the tactical display. A line of red markers stretched across the galactic map, Accord fleets stationed along every major hyperlane leading into human space. The blockade was nearly complete. A warning, a challenge. Graves didn't hesitate. All fleets prepare for engagement. The officers around him didn't question the order. There was no debate. The time for diplomacy had passed the moment the Accord declared humanity a threat. Now, there was only one response. War. The UNS Eternity led the charge. In the Seldari system, the Accord's fleet commander, High Warden Threx, watched his scanners as thousands of human warships exited hyperspace. Impossible, he muttered. He had expected a slow build-up, negotiations, the usual hesitation that came before war. But humanity hadn't waited. They had launched their attack without warning. Alarms blared across the command deck. The human fleet was already deploying fighter swarms and targeting Accord capital ships. Energy spikes signaled the charging of railguns and mass drivers. Humanity hadn't come to posture. They had come to kill. "Raise shields! All weapons fire!" Threx roared. But it was too late. The first battle of the war lasted less than an hour. The Accord fleet was shattered. What had been intended as an impenetrable blockade became a massacre. The UNS Eternity alone had annihilated 3 battleships with precision orbital strikes. Kinetic rounds, traveling at near-light speeds, tore through enemy hulls as if they were made of paper. The survivors fled. The message was clear. Humanity would not be contained. The news spread like wildfire. Across the galaxy, species watched in stunned silence as human forces pushed forward, smashing through the Accord's defenses with ruthless efficiency. On the Accord's council world of Vandros Prime, the ruling species gathered in a desperate emergency session. Holograms flickered with footage of human warships carving through their fleets, soldiers in advanced power armor storming planetary defenses. "They don't fight like the Zorvax," a Kavir diplomat hissed. "They don't hold formations, they don't retreat, they don't hesitate." A Gathari warlord slammed his fist against the table. "Then we need to strike harder. We outnumber them 5-1. A solemn voice cut through the argument. "It doesn't matter." All eyes turned to the Seldari representative. His species had fought humanity at the Seldari system. They had seen what the others had not. "They fight like they've already won," he said. Silence fell over the chamber. The war had only just begun. And already, the Accord was afraid. On the bridge of the Eternity, Graves watched as his fleets spread like wildfire. Planets fell, enemy fleets were obliterated, and the Accord's lines crumbled faster than anyone had predicted. But he knew this was only the beginning. They would regroup. They would strike back. Good. Let them try. Graves turned to Vasquez. "Prepare the next assault. We take the Kavir stronghold next." Vasquez nodded. "And after that?" Graves's lips curled into a cold smile. "We don't stop until they beg for mercy." The war had begun, and humanity would finish it. The Accord was reeling. What was supposed to be a containment effort had turned into an unrelenting nightmare. Human warships had torn through the Seldari system, leaving behind only wreckage and death. The outer defenses of the Accord had been shattered in days, not months, and now the United Terran Directorate was pushing deeper into enemy space. Admiral Graves stood at the heart of it all, watching as the greatest military machine humanity had ever built ground its enemies to dust. The Kavir stronghold was next. An ancient race, the Kavir had once been warlords who dominated entire sectors. Their homeworld, Vandros 9, was a fortress, protected by planetary shields, automated defense turrets, and a fleet stationed in permanent orbit. It was considered an impenetrable bastion. Humanity didn't care. The UNS Eternity led the charge, backed by the 2nd and 5th Expeditionary Fleets. 7,000 warships, more than the Zorvax had ever faced at once, surged forward. They emerged from hyperspace in a perfect formation, their arrival accompanied by the deafening silence of the void, just before hell erupted. Kavir warships launched interceptors and missile swarms. Energy cannons powered up, and planetary defense systems locked onto human vessels. The battlefield became a swirling storm of plasma fire, railgun rounds, and detonations as both sides clashed. But the humans had come prepared. Tactical A. I synchronized the fleet's movements with near-perfect precision. Capital ships laid down devastating suppressive fire, while smaller strike groups weaved through the chaos, cutting through Kavir defenses like blades through flesh. The UNS Eternity deployed its Dreadnought-class railguns, each round traveling at near-light speed, obliterating enemy ships in single shots. On the bridge, Graves watched the chaos unfold. "Planetary shields are holding," Vasquez reported. "We'll need ground forces to breach." Graves nodded. "Deploy the Marines." The order sent thousands of drop pods screaming through Vandros 9's atmosphere. The planetary shields, weakened by the orbital bombardment, flickered as the first wave broke through. Then the real battle began. General O'Neill led the charge. Clad in advanced power armor, wielding a high-caliber plasma rifle, he and his troops stormed the capital city of Luthos Prime. The Kavir had deployed thousands of ground troops, their towering war machines lumbering through the streets, firing barrages of plasma fire. But human soldiers weren't just warriors. They were killers. O'Neill's men moved in tight, efficient squads. Drones scouted enemy positions, feeding real-time data to combat HUDs. Grenades arced over cover, EMP bursts disabled enemy mechs, and sniper teams eliminated Kavir officers with terrifying precision. A massive Kavir walker turned the corner, its heavy cannons glowing. O'Neill didn't hesitate. He raised his wrist, marking the target with a simple voice command. "Valkyrie strike, Sector 3B. From above, a hypersonic human aircraft screamed downward, releasing a payload of tungsten rods. The projectiles, accelerated to near-terminal velocity, struck the walker like meteors, reducing it to molten slag. O'Neill grinned. "Push forward!" The battle raged for hours. Streets burned, buildings crumbled, and the once mighty Kavir warriors fell one by one. They had expected a siege. Instead, they got an execution. By nightfall, the Kavir government was in ruins. Vandross 9, once a stronghold, was now just another human conquest. O'Neill stood atop the shattered remains of the Kavir command center, raising the Terran banner as his troops cheered. Humanity had claimed another world. On the bridge of the Eternity, Graves listened to the victory reports in silence. The Accord was losing. Fast. Vasquez exhaled. "They never had a chance?" Graves didn't smile. "They still think they do," he said, "and that makes them dangerous." Vasquez frowned. "You think they'll retaliate?" Graves nodded. "They have no choice. Their only hope is a counterattack before we steamroll them completely." O'Neill's voice crackled over the comm. "What's next, Admiral?" Graves stared at the galactic map, his eyes locked on the next major Accord stronghold. "We keep going." The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The Accord was desperate. Humanity had turned their containment effort into a full-scale slaughter, sweeping through star systems with unrelenting force. The fall of Vandross 9 sent shockwaves through the galactic community. What was once a mighty Kavir stronghold had been reduced to rubble in mere days. Now every species in the Accord knew one thing for certain. If they didn't stop humanity now, they never would. And so they planned their counterstrike. Deep within the Accord's central command station on Zal-Ra Prime, the leaders of the 5-member coalition gathered. Holograms of burning cities and shattered fleets played around them, the brutal efficiency of humanity's war machine undeniable. "This cannot continue," Warlord Jekthar of the Kavir snarled, his claws flexing against the conference table. "They have no mercy, no restraint. If we hesitate, they will burn our homeworlds next." The Gathari diplomat, Vrexal, hissed in agreement. "We underestimated them. We assumed they would fight with hesitation, with politics in mind." His eyes flickered with an eerie glow. Instead, they fight like they were born for this. The Seldari representative, one of the few survivors from the first engagement, looked grim. "We must strike at their heart. Not skirmishes, not battles. A killing blow." The room fell silent. They all knew what he meant. Earth. The Accord's plan was simple. Strike where humanity was most vulnerable. Their fleets were powerful, their armies unstoppable. But Earth? Earth was their home, their legacy, their pride. If the Accord could burn Earth, they could break humanity's will to fight. They assembled a fleet unlike anything seen before, over 20,000 warships, crewed by the best soldiers and tacticians their species had to offer. Every last resource was poured into this mission. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. And so they launched their assault. On the bridge of the UNS Eternity, Admiral Graves stood motionless, eyes fixed on the tactical display. Red markers, thousands of them, swarmed toward Earth, the largest enemy fleet humanity had ever faced. The room was dead silent. Even Vasquez, usually unshaken, paled at the sight. "They're going for Earth," she whispered. O'Neill's voice came through the comms, cold and sharp. "They want to break us." Graves exhaled slowly, then turned to his officers. His voice carried through the bridge with unshakable resolve. "Then let's teach them what happens when you back humanity into a corner." The Battle of Earth would be remembered for millennia. The Accord fleet exited hyperspace just beyond the Sol system, weapons primed, expecting to find Earth vulnerable. Instead, they found the largest human armada ever assembled. 700,000 warships. Every Terran fleet had been recalled. Every colony had sent reinforcements. Every last resource humanity could muster had been funneled into this moment. The Accord expected a battle. What they got was an extinction event. The void between the fleets turned into a hellscape of fire and destruction. Human dreadnoughts unleashed railgun rounds the size of city buses, tearing through enemy ships like paper. Swarms of Terran fighter craft moved with coordinated precision, executing complex maneuvers that shattered enemy formations. The Eternity spearheaded the assault, its experimental weapon systems cutting through the largest Accord warships with ease. Plasma lances seared through hulls, while kinetic slugs turned battlecruisers into drifting debris. The Accord fought back with everything they had. Their warships outnumbered humanity's, but numbers didn't matter anymore. Humanity had been fighting this war for survival from the moment New Avalon burned. They had been reforged in blood and fire. And now, they were unstoppable. On the Accord command ship, panic spread. "They're overwhelming us," a Seldari officer cried out. "We can't—" A kinetic round slammed through the command deck, tearing half the ship apart in an instant. Explosions rippled through the fleet as ship after ship was obliterated. Admiral Graves watched it all unfold, eyes cold, voice steady. "Show them no mercy." The battle lasted 12 hours. By the end, the Accord fleet was gone. 20,000 warships had entered Sol. None had survived. Humanity had won. The Accord had gambled everything and lost. Their military was broken, their leadership shattered. The survivors fled, their coalition in ruins. On Earth, billions of humans cheered. Across the stars, colonies rejoiced. But on the bridge of the Eternity, Admiral Graves wasn't celebrating. He knew what came next. This war wasn't over. It was time to take the fight to them. Humanity would not be contained. Humanity would rule. The war was no longer about survival. Humanity had crushed the Accord's attempt to wipe out Earth. Their 20,000 ship armada had been annihilated, their fleets shattered, their military left in ruins. But Admiral Graves knew one truth about war. If you left the enemy alive, they would return. And humanity did not believe in second chances. Now, it was time for vengeance. The invasion of the Accord's core worlds began with brutal efficiency. Humanity launched a campaign that spanned entire star systems. Every fleet, every warship, every soldier that Earth could spare was mobilized. The days of defending human space were over. Now, humanity was bringing the war to the Accord's doorstep. The first target, the Gathari homeworld. The planet Xiphos 4 was a technological marvel. Massive orbital stations, planetary defense grids, and an artificial ring around the planet that housed most of their industrial power. It had stood untouched for centuries. No enemy had ever breached its defenses. Then humanity arrived. 700,000 warships had gathered in Earth's defense. Now they moved outward like a vengeful storm, sweeping through space, leaving nothing but debris behind. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the Eternity, watching the planet loom closer. A cold fury burned in his chest. He had lost friends. He had watched the Accord massacre human colonies, had seen innocent families burned from orbit. Now, it was their turn to suffer. "All ships," Graves said, his voice like steel. "Commence bombardment." The sky above Xiphos 4 burned. Human dreadnoughts unleashed tungsten rods the size of skyscrapers, each one slamming into the surface with the force of a nuclear detonation. Plasma lances cut through orbital stations, sending fire and wreckage spiraling toward the planet below. Gathari warships scrambled to defend their home, but they were already too late. Human fighter squadrons weaved through their defenses, precision striking shield generators and key infrastructure. Special forces teams deployed onto the surface, assassinating high-value targets before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The Gathari had once prided themselves on their tactical superiority. Now, they were running for their lives. General O'Neill led the ground assault. As the first waves of dropships broke through the planet's atmosphere, anti-air defenses opened fire, filling the sky with plasma bolts. Some human ships were hit, spiraling into the cityscape below, but most made it through. O'Neill and his men landed in the middle of the Gathari capital. The city was already in chaos. Fires raged through towering skyscrapers. The streets were filled with terrified civilians, scrambling for cover as human mechs marched through the rubble. The Gathari military tried to push back. Their shock troopers, clad in advanced battle armor, engaged the human marines in brutal street-to-street combat. Energy weapons flared, explosions ripped through buildings, and screams echoed through the burning ruins. But the humans had come prepared. Sniper teams eliminated Gathari officers before they could issue orders. Drone swarms overloaded enemy targeting systems. EMP strikes disabled their tanks, leaving them vulnerable to devastating missile barrages. O'Neill's team moved fast, cutting through enemy resistance like a scalpel. As they pushed toward the Gathari command center, he activated his comm. "Admiral, the capital's defenses are collapsing. The enemy is in full retreat." Graves's voice came through, cold and merciless. "Then finish it!" O'Neill did not hesitate. He raised his plasma rifle and led his men forward. By nightfall, Xiphos 4 belonged to humanity. The Gathari government had been executed. The remaining military forces surrendered. And those who didn't? They were wiped out. Across the planet, human forces secured control. Their flag was raised above the ruins of the capital, a grim reminder that humanity did not forgive. The Accord had thought they could exterminate humans. Instead, they had sealed their own fate. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the Eternity, watching the burning planet below. Vasquez exhaled. "That's 2 core worlds down." O'Neill's voice came through the comm again. "The Gathari are done. What's next?" Graves didn't even blink. "The Seldari homeworld." Vasquez's eyes flickered with dark amusement. "We're not stopping, are we?" Graves turned toward the galactic map, showing the remaining Accord worlds. His jaw tightened. "They wanted a war," he said, voice low, dangerous. "Now, we give them one." The conquest of the Accord had begun, and humanity would not stop until the galaxy was theirs. The Seldari homeworld of Vahzir was the jewel of the Accord. It was a planet of towering crystalline spires, floating citadels, and lush bioluminescent forests that stretched for miles. Unlike the industrial worlds of the Gathari or the war-forged fortresses of the Kavir, Vahzir was a place of peace, art, and diplomacy. It had never seen war on its surface. Until now. Admiral Graves stared at the holographic projection of the planet. Even from orbit, Vahzir was breathtaking, its twin moons casting a pale glow over the sapphire oceans. He almost felt bad for what was about to happen. almost. The Seldari were the ones who started this war, Vasquez muttered, standing beside him. They whispered in the ears of the other species, pushed them to attack our colonies. Now look where it got them. Graves didn't respond. Instead, he turned to his officers. Deploy the fleet. 700,000 warships burned through the void, their engines leaving trails of fire as they descended upon Vazir. Seldari defense stations scrambled to react, their fleet mobilizing in a desperate attempt to repel the invasion. Their warships were sleek, elegant, built for precision strikes rather than brute force. They had been designed to win through diplomacy, through superior tactics, through carefully calculated engagements. They had never fought an enemy like humanity. The first exchange lasted minutes. The Seldari fleet opened fire, unleashing energy lances that cut through space with pinpoint accuracy. Human dreadnoughts responded with brutal efficiency. Railguns the size of skyscrapers fired hypersonic rounds that tore through shields, slicing ships in half before their crews could even react. Missiles swarmed through the battlefield, artificial intelligence guiding them past countermeasures, slamming into hulls with devastating force. The Seldari fought bravely, but bravery meant nothing against overwhelming firepower. In less than an hour, their navy was gone. Planetary defenses activated. Vazir's surface was protected by a shield network designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The Seldari had believed it was impenetrable, an absolute safeguard against any invasion. They were wrong. Humanity had already faced these kinds of defenses in past battles. They had learned. They had adapted. A fleet of stealth bombers slipped past the outer defenses, deploying specialized payloads designed to overload shield harmonics. The moment the energy field flickered, even for a second, human battleships unleashed their full might. Tungsten rods fell from orbit, striking with the force of nuclear warheads. The first impact turned a city into dust. The second cracked the surface of a continent. The shield network collapsed within minutes. The invasion had begun. General O'Neill led the first wave. Dropships descended through the atmosphere, dodging sporadic anti-air fire as they deployed human forces across key strategic points. The Seldari had no standing army. Their soldiers were ceremonial, trained for peacekeeping, not war. They were slaughtered. Mechs the size of buildings marched through the elegant cities, their plasma cannons cutting down whatever resistance remained. Drone swarms blanketed the skies, seeking out and destroying enemy strongholds before they could organize. O'Neill and his Marines pushed through the capital, moving street by street. Seldari civilians screamed in terror as the fighting drew closer. Some tried to run, others begged for mercy. O'Neill gave none. These were the same people who had signed the order to exterminate human colonies. The same people who had watched as Vandros 9 burned, as billions of innocent lives were wiped out. Now, it was their turn. The Seldari Council was holed up in their grand palace, a floating fortress suspended above the capital. It had been their center of power for centuries, a place where they had dictated the fate of countless civilizations. Now, it was nothing more than a target. Human strike teams infiltrated the palace, moving like shadows through its halls. Security forces put up a token resistance, but they were no match for cybernetically enhanced operatives trained for planetary subjugation. Within an hour, the council was dragged from their chambers. O'Neill stood over them, his expression unreadable. The Seldari leader, an elder with shimmering silver skin, looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Please," she whispered, "we surrender." O'Neill tilted his head, as if considering her words. Then he activated his comm. "Admiral Graves, the council is secured. Orders?" There was a long pause. Then Graves's voice came through, cold and final. "No survivors." O'Neill nodded. He raised his rifle. The war crimes tribunals would be held later. by humans, for humans. The Seldari Council would not live to see them. By nightfall, Vazir was in flames. The floating citadels fell from the sky. The forests burned. The oceans turned black with ash. And above the planet, the human fleet stood watch. Vasquez let out a breath. "That's 3 core worlds down." O'Neill's voice crackled through the comms. "The Seldari are finished. What's next?" Graves didn't hesitate. "The Kavir homeworld." Vasquez grinned. "The warriors." Graves's jaw tightened. "The last obstacle." The Kavir were different. They were not diplomats. They were not politicians. They were warriors. And if humanity wanted to break the Accord completely, they would have to face the deadliest fighters in the galaxy. And win. The war against the Accord was nearing its final chapter. The Kavir homeworld, Dracos, stood as the last bastion of their alliance. Unlike the Seldari and Githari, the Kavir did not beg for mercy. They did not surrender. They were warriors bred for battle, a species that had conquered and crushed lesser civilizations for centuries. But they had never faced humanity at its most ruthless. Admiral Graves knew this would be different. Unlike the previous invasions, this would not be a slaughter. The Kavir would fight to the last soldier, to the last breath. There would be no pleas for mercy, no desperate peace offerings. And so, humanity came prepared. The battle for Dracos was the bloodiest of the war. The Kavir fleets did not break upon the first engagement. Their warships were built like fortresses, covered in thick armor plating, bristling with weapons designed for relentless combat. They did not retreat, did not falter. But they did fall. Humanity's fleet moved with surgical precision. Railguns punched through even the thickest hulls, missiles found the cracks in their defenses, and electronic warfare teams scrambled their communications, cutting them off from each other. The fight dragged on for days, but one by one, the Kavir warships were reduced to smoldering wreckage. And then, the invasion began. On the surface, the Kavir made their final stand. Their warriors fought like demons, refusing to give ground, turning every ruined city into a fortress, every street into a battlefield. Even as orbital bombardments shattered their defenses, even as mechs and tanks crushed their lines, they kept fighting. Humanity had never faced an enemy so unyielding. But in the end, it didn't matter. The Kavir had centuries of battle experience, but humanity had something greater: adaptability. They learned, adjusted, countered every tactic thrown at them. What should have been a months-long siege was over in a matter of weeks. The Kavir High Command was wiped out. Their last warriors fell, refusing to surrender. Dracos burned. The Accord was no more. Admiral Graves stood aboard the Eternity, watching the ruined surface of the last enemy world. He had thought he would feel something. Relief, triumph, even satisfaction. Instead, there was only silence. Vasquez broke it. "We did it." Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "It's over." Graves exhaled. "No." He turned to the galactic map. The stars stretched out before him, vast and endless. "This was just the beginning." O'Neill's voice crackled over the comms. "We've taken their worlds. What now?" Graves's gaze was cold, unreadable. "We rebuild, expand, secure our place in the galaxy." He looked at the shattered remains of the once mighty Accord. "And we make sure no one, no species, ever threatens humanity again." The war was over. But humanity's dominion had just begun. The distress signal came from the far edge of the Orion Arm, a cold, desolate sector where few dared to venture. It wasn't just the location that made it eerie. It was the silence that followed. A signal should come with follow-ups, with desperate pleas or at least a beacon's pulse. But this one? One short burst, then nothing. The Galactic Coalition had rules about responding to distress calls. Usually a survey ship would be dispatched, loaded with medical supplies and a standard diplomatic unit. They would assess the situation, determine if aid was necessary, and either render assistance or call for reinforcements. Simple. Routine. But this time, no survey teams volunteered. No diplomatic unit stepped forward. Because this signal came from the Abyssal Rift, a place known for two things: mystery and death. So they called the humans. The UEG Resolute dropped out of FTL just beyond the rift, its hull thrumming as it adjusted to real space. Captain Elias Cade stood on the bridge, his fingers drumming against the steel railing. His crew, hardened veterans from the human Deathworlder fleets, were already at their stations. "Status?" Cade asked, his voice steady. Lieutenant Marquez flicked through the holo displays, scanning the void ahead. "Signal originated from a shattered moon, 200 clicks from our position. No follow-up signals. No response to hails." "Any life signs?" Marquez shook her head. "Not yet. But the rift interferes with standard scans. We'll have to get closer." Cade exhaled through his nose. The rift wasn't just any ordinary void. It was a graveyard of ships, a stretch of space littered with derelicts that had met some unknown, terrible fate. Some said pirates lurked here. Others whispered about things worse than pirates. The captain tapped his communicator. "Squad 1, gear up. We're going in." 15 minutes later, a team of heavily armed soldiers descended onto the fractured remains of the moon. Their boots crunched against black dust, their visors sweeping through the abandoned wreckage. Rusted metal and shattered bulkheads told a silent story of destruction. Corporal Davis knelt by a torn-apart hull and ran a gloved hand over deep, jagged gashes. "These aren't impact marks. Something ripped through this ship." Sergeant Locke swore under his breath. "Biosigns. Faint, but something's alive in there." Cade's voice crackled over the comms. "Proceed with caution." Davis nodded and took point, leading the squad deeper into the wreckage. The air grew thick, heavy with something unseen. Their helmets compensated, filtering out toxins, but the feeling remained, an oppressive weight pressing down on them. Then the whispering began. A faint, unnatural sound slithered through their comms, just at the edge of perception. A voice, but not quite a voice. More like the idea of a voice, clawing at the edges of their minds. "Contact!" Davis shouted, raising his rifle. The shadows moved. Something was here. Something was waiting, and the Deathworlders had answered its call. Davis's shout barely had time to echo before the shadows surged forward. The squad's training kicked in instantly, rifles raised, fingers tightening on triggers. But hesitation held them back for a split second. What were they shooting at? The movement wasn't like anything they'd seen before. It was fluid, like liquid darkness slithering through the wreckage. No distinct form, no defined edges, just shifting blackness with too many eyes, gleaming faintly in the dim emergency lights. Then it struck. Corporal Davis barely had time to scream before something lashed out from the void, slamming into him with the force of a rail gun. He was airborne for less than a second before his body hit the bulkhead with a sickening crunch. His rifle clattered to the ground, useless. "Open fire!" Locke bellowed. The squad erupted, their weapons spewing streaks of energy into the dark. The corridor lit up in bursts of white and red, the muzzle flashes revealing glimpses of something wrong, jagged limbs, shifting plates of organic metal, mouths that weren't in the right place. The bullets and plasma struck true, but the thing didn't scream, it shuddered, as if registering pain for the first time in its existence. Then it moved again. Fast. Too fast. Private Holt was next. A tendril shot through his chest plate as if the reinforced armor was nothing more than paper. He gasped, looking down at the writhing limb impaling him before the thing ripped him backward into the abyss. His body vanished into the dark, leaving only a smear of blood on the floor. "Fall back," Locke roared, dragging Davis by his vest as the squad retreated. Cade's voice snapped through the comms. "What the hell is happening down there? Hostile contact, unknown entity, highly adaptive, highly lethal." Locke barked, his breath ragged. "Holt's gone. Davis is down. We need immediate evac." The team backpedaled, laying down suppressing fire as they moved. But the thing didn't charge. It simply melted into the shadows again, watching, learning. Marquez's voice came over the comms, tight with tension. "Sergeant, we're picking up more movement, multiple contacts. They're all around you." Locke felt his blood run cold. "Understood. We're coming out hot." The wreckage groaned as if the moon itself were awakening. The whispers returned, louder now, crawling into their skulls like invasive parasites. "You were not meant to answer the call." It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was an infestation in their minds, something old and waiting, something that had been here long before the distress signal, and they had walked straight into its trap. Locke gritted his teeth, hauling Davis to his feet as the squad reached the exit point. The shuttle was already descending, its thrusters kicking up dust. The last two Marines laid down heavy fire, their shots carving glowing wounds into the shifting darkness. Then the ground beneath them cracked. A hand, if it could be called that, erupted from the surface, its fingers long and twisted, covered in barbed chitin. It grabbed Private Rourke by the leg and yanked. Rourke's scream was cut short as he was dragged downward into the abyss, vanishing into the moon's fractured core. The squad didn't stop. They couldn't. The shuttle door slid open, and Locke shoved Davis inside before turning to fire one last round into the encroaching dark. He could see them now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, half-formed nightmares watching with unreadable intent. The moment they stepped onto the ship, Cade's voice rang out, "Get us the hell out of here." The shuttle's engines roared, launching them away from the ruins. The moment they breached orbit, the distress signal went silent. Gone. As if it had never existed. Locke sat heavily against the bulkhead, sweat dripping from his brow. "That wasn't a distress call," he muttered, his voice hollow. "That was a lure." Cade exhaled, rubbing his temples. "And we answered it." Outside, the abyssal rift stretched endlessly, silent once more. Waiting. The Resolute's med bay smelled of antiseptics and burnt ozone, the tang of battlefield trauma clinging to the recycled air. Davis lay on a cot, his breath shallow, his ribs shattered from the impact. The medtechs worked on stabilizing him, but everyone in the room knew the truth. Whatever hit him could have killed him outright. It had chosen not to. Cade stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. His mind raced, trying to piece together what they'd just faced. The rift had a reputation, but no reports had ever mentioned that. Creatures moving like liquid shadow, tendrils with unnatural precision, voices speaking inside their heads. And that wasn't the worst of it. Marquez appeared at his side, her face grim. "Captain, we've got a problem." Cade turned, already knowing he wouldn't like what was coming next. "Go on." She handed him a data pad. "The distress signal? It's gone. Completely erased. The ship's logs show no record of us ever receiving it. As far as the Coalition is concerned, we were never called here." Cade felt a cold chill creep down his spine. "That's impossible." She swallowed. "There's more. The shuttle's flight data. Everything we recorded in that wreck? Gone. I checked the black box. It's clean. Like we were never there." Cade's grip on the datapad tightened. Someone, or something, had wiped their records the moment they left that cursed moon. Locke, standing nearby, let out a humorless laugh. "So let me get this straight. We just fought off some unholy nightmare that tore through my squad, barely escaped, And now there's no evidence we were ever there? He shook his head, his jaw tightening. Convenient? The room fell into a tense silence. Then Davis stirred. His fingers twitched, his breathing quickened. One of the medtechs reached for a sedative, but before they could inject it, his eyes snapped open. And they weren't his anymore. The whites of his eyes had gone pitch black, his pupils glowing with a faint, sickly light. His mouth opened, and from his throat came a voice that wasn't his own. A voice that didn't belong in this world. You should not have answered. The medbay's monitors flickered wildly, the lights overhead dimming as an unnatural pressure filled the air. Every screen in the room glowed with static, displaying unreadable symbols, glyphs that seemed to shift whenever one tried to focus on them. Davis's body spasmed violently, his back arching off the cot. The medtechs scrambled to restrain him, but his strength was inhuman, throwing one of them across the room. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Davis collapsed back onto the cot, unconscious once more. The air in the room felt lighter, the unnatural weight lifting. The screens returned to normal. The static was gone. Cade's heart pounded as he stepped closer. "What the hell was that?" Marquez whispered, barely breathing. "Captain, I don't think we left that thing behind." Cade's gaze shifted to the unconscious soldier, his blood running cold. They had escaped the abyssal rift. But something had come back with them. The Resolute's war room was deathly silent. The officers and specialists gathered around the central holotable, its soft glow casting eerie shadows across their faces. The screen displayed a full-body scan of Davis, his vitals surprisingly stable. But the real problem wasn't his body. It was his mind. Cade rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling in. "Tell me something useful." Dr. Elias Harlow, the ship's chief medical officer, exhaled sharply. "Medically, Davis should be dead. The impact alone should have shattered his spine, but he's healing at an unnatural rate. Brain scans show activity in areas that shouldn't be active. And those symbols?" He pointed at the screen, where the medbay logs still showed flickering glyphs. "That's not just a visual glitch. It's rewriting parts of our database." Cade clenched his jaw. "How the hell does a human brain rewrite a ship's systems?" Harlow shook his head. "It doesn't. But whatever hitched a ride with us? It does." Marquez leaned forward, her voice low. "Captain, this isn't just some alien parasite, it's intelligent. It knew we were coming. It wiped the distress signal, erased our flight data, and now it's inside Davis, tampering with our systems. This was never an accident." Locke scoffed, arms crossed. "Then what was it? Some kind of damn test?" Marquez hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe, or worse, maybe it was an invitation." The air grew heavier. Cade could see the unease in their eyes. They were hardened soldiers, Deathworlders who had seen horrors across the stars. And yet, this was different. This wasn't a battle against some war-hungry species or a rogue AI. This was something they didn't understand. Cade straightened. "All right, we stop playing defense. If this thing wants to test us, we hit back." He turned to Harlow. "We need to wake Davis up, now." The doctor hesitated. "Captain, I don't think—" "That wasn't a request." Harlow sighed and tapped at his datapad. "I'll prep a neural stabilizer, but if we wake him up and he's not alone in there—" He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what he meant. The medbay was eerily quiet when Cade arrived. The usual hum of medical equipment felt off, like the machines themselves were holding their breath. Davis lay on the cot, his face peaceful. Too peaceful, like something was wearing his body instead of inhabiting it. Harlow stood beside the cot, syringe in hand. "This should counteract any unnatural brain interference. If we're lucky, he wakes up as himself. Cade nodded. And if we're not? Harlow's fingers tightened around the syringe. Then we find out what it really wants. He injected the stabilizer. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Davis gasped. His body convulsed, his fingers clawing at the sheets as his breath came in sharp, ragged gulps. His eyes snapped open, black as deep space, but this time, there was something else behind them. Awareness. His lips parted, and when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. It wasn't one voice, it was many. You were not meant to come here. Cade took a step forward, his voice steady. Who are you? Davis's head twitched slightly, as if trying to recall a memory that didn't belong to him. Then he smiled. And that was worse than anything else. We are the first, the last, the forgotten. Marquez's voice crackled through Cade's earpiece. Captain, we just lost control of navigation. The ship's moving. Cade's blood ran cold. Moving where? There was a pause. Then Marquez's voice came back, shaken. Back to the rift. Cade turned back to Davis, his fists clenched. You're taking us back? Davis, or the thing inside him, chuckled. It was a hollow, empty sound. You answered the call. Now you must finish it. And just like that, the Resolute was no longer in their control. They were going back to the abyssal rift. And this time, they weren't just visitors. They were sacrifices. The Resolute moved like a ship possessed. The thrusters burned at full power, course locked, override commands ignored. The crew scrambled across the bridge, shouting, hands flying over consoles, but nothing responded. They weren't flying into the rift. They were being dragged back. Cade stood frozen for half a second, his mind racing. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a trap from the very start. He activated the ship-wide comms. All hands prepare for emergency action. We are no longer in control. Brace for whatever comes next. The crew obeyed without question. That was the thing about Deathworlders. They didn't panic. They adapted, fought back, even against nightmares. Davis, no, the thing inside him, sat up slowly, the shadows playing across his sharp features. His blackened eyes regarded Cade with something like amusement. You misunderstand. Cade leveled his sidearm at him. Enlighten me. You believe you fight against the unknown, that you resist, but you were chosen, summoned. You were always going to return. Cade stepped forward, pressing the muzzle of his gun against Davis's forehead. Then tell me why. Davis didn't blink, didn't even flinch. Because only Deathworlders can open the door. The word sent a cold spike through Cade's chest. Before he could demand more, the ship lurched. The viewscreen filled with darkness, vast and endless. The abyssal rift. But something had changed. The rift was no longer just an expanse of dead stars and broken wrecks. It was alive. A pulsing, shifting mass loomed in the distance, a structure or a creature so massive it defied logic. A wound in the universe itself. The longer Cade stared, the more his brain refused to understand. Geometry twisted. Space folded inward. And at the center of it all, something was waiting. Marquez's voice broke through the static, tight with horror. Captain, the rift, it's responding to us. Cade forced himself to speak. Explain. She took a shaky breath. Sensors show something, a structure or an entity, and it's reacting to our presence. Davis's head tilted slightly. It wakes. Cade pressed the gun harder against his skull. Wake what? Davis finally smiled. Not cruelly, not mockingly, just knowingly. The thing that buried the first civilizations. The ship shuddered. Klaxons blared. Warning lights flared across the bridge as gravity itself twisted. Something beyond the rift was opening, and whatever was inside had just noticed them. The Resolute groaned like a wounded beast as the rift twisted around it, space warping in unnatural spirals. Cade felt the weight of something pressing against his skull, not physically, but in his mind, as though unseen fingers were sifting through his thoughts. On the bridge, chaos reigned. Consoles flickered between static and unreadable glyphs. Some of the crew clutched their heads, murmuring, eyes unfocused. Others fought against the ship's systems, desperately trying to override whatever force had seized them. Locke cursed as he slammed his fists against his terminal. "Navigation's shot, engines too. We're being pulled somewhere, Captain." Marquez's hands trembled over her console. "It's not just pulling us, it's reading us." Cade turned sharply. "What?" She swallowed, tapping through what little data remained. "There's an energy signature coming from the center of the rift, where that thing is. It's scanning us, adapting, like it's trying to understand us before we arrive." Davis, still possessed, still unnervingly calm, stood at the center of the bridge, his expression unreadable. The abyss does not take blindly. It selects. It prepares. Cade's fingers tightened around his sidearm. "Enough with the cryptic bullshit! What is in there? What the hell does it want?" Davis turned, his darkened eyes locking onto Cade's with an intensity that felt almost sorrowful. "A weapon." The ship lurched. The darkness outside moved. For a brief, horrifying second, Cade saw it. The shape buried within the rift. It wasn't just big. It wasn't just alive. It was waiting. An ancient mass of shifting, unreadable geometry. A thing that didn't fit in the universe's laws. It had no true form, only the vague suggestion of one, like something trapped between realities, unable to fully manifest in their world. But it was trying, and the Resolute was the key. Marquez's voice was barely a whisper. "We weren't the first." Cade turned toward her. "What?" She gestured to her screen, her face pale. "I don't know how, but I found something buried in the data. Fragments of an old transmission. It's thousands of years old, older than any known species." Locke leaned in. "Play it." The speakers crackled. A distorted voice, barely human, barely alive, came through, twisted by time and decay. "If you hear this, do not answer. Do not come." The ship shuddered again. Outside, the shifting mass in the rift began to open, and for the first time, Cade realized the horrifying truth. They hadn't found a distress signal. They'd found a warning, and they had already gone too far. The ship trembled as the abyss around them twisted and churned, pulling them deeper into the unknown. The thing inside the rift, the thing waiting for them, was waking up. Cade's knuckles were white against the grip of his sidearm, but he forced himself to stay steady. Deathworlders didn't break under pressure. They adapted. They fought. He turned to Marquez, who was still frozen, staring at the playback of the ancient transmission. "How much of that message can you recover?" She swallowed hard. I don't know. It's corrupted, degraded. Whatever sent it is long gone." Her fingers flew over her console, trying to extract more data, but static filled the speakers, the voice distorted beyond recognition. "Not a place, it is a prison." The words sent a chill down Cade's spine. Davis, or the thing inside him, watched with eerie amusement. His eyes, once human, were nothing but endless voids, swallowing light and reflecting nothing back. "You are beginning to understand." Cade leveled his gun at him. "Then make me understand. What the hell is that thing in the rift?" Davis smiled, and it was wrong. Not his usual cocky grin, but something detached, like an observer looking at an insect trying to grasp the universe. "A remnant of the First War. A war that ended before your kind ever left your world." The ship lurched violently, the inertial dampeners struggling to compensate. Sparks flew from a nearby console. A junior officer was thrown against the bulkhead with a sickening crack. Cade gritted his teeth. What war? Davis tilted his head, as if amused by the question. The war that shaped the stars. The war that buried entire species in forgotten time. His blackened eyes seemed to flicker, like staring into an event horizon. You call yourselves Deathworlders, believing you are the most dangerous beings in the cosmos. You are children, infants who have only begun to grasp what true horrors exist. Marquez's voice came through, tight with barely contained panic. Captain, I don't know what's happening, but the rift, it's moving. It's not just a location. It's reacting to us, because we're here. The implications settled like lead in Cade's gut. It needed something to wake it up. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the bridge. Davis nodded slowly. It needed warriors, blood-bound creatures of war and survival. It needed you. Cade's stomach twisted. Why? Davis's smile widened, and this time Cade could see something shifting behind his eyes. Something ancient, something not him. Because Deathworlders do not break, they do not surrender, and that is exactly what it needs. A warning klaxon blared. Locke shouted from his station, his voice laced with something close to fear. Captain, we're crossing the event horizon. We're going in! Cade spun toward the main viewport, just in time to see the abyss split open. It wasn't a portal. It wasn't a gateway. It was a maw, a colossal, shifting void of writhing, twisting blackness, surrounded by ruins of ships, vessels from species long dead, drifting like carcasses in an ancient graveyard. And at the center of it all was something else. A structure, maybe, a creature, both. It pulsed with unnatural energy, its form impossible to describe, shifting between solid and intangible, as if it existed in more than one reality at once. Cade's breath caught. He had seen monsters before. He had seen war, genocide, the horrors of space. But this? This was something else. Something that had been locked away for a reason. The ship buckled again as it was pulled closer, the gravitational forces of the rift dragging them into its core. Cade made a decision. Locke, prep emergency thrusters. Marquez, divert all power to the engines. Burn everything if you have to. Locke's fingers flew over his console. Not responding. It's overriding every damn system we have. Davis exhaled softly. You cannot fight what you do not understand. Cade turned on him. Then help us understand, damn you. If this thing wanted us dead, it could have ripped us apart already. What does it want? Davis regarded him, expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. It does not want to kill you. His blackened eyes flickered, and for the first time since his possession, something human flashed across his face. Fear. It wants to make you part of it. A chilling silence fell over the bridge. Cade's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. This wasn't just a trap. It wasn't just an ancient horror waiting to be freed. It was recruiting. The rift wasn't a place. It was a living war machine, waiting for something strong enough to wield it, waiting for something ruthless, waiting for Deathworlders. The ship trembled violently as the rift consumed them, swallowing the resolute whole. And then, everything went dark. Darkness swallowed the resolute, a void deeper than space itself, crushing, suffocating. Every screen went black. Every system failed in an instant. The hum of the engines, the distant whir of the ventilation system. Gone. For the first time in his life, Cade felt truly blind. Then came the voices. Whispers slithering through the void, curling around his mind like unseen tendrils. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel their meaning. Hunger, expectation, an ancient, quiet laughter. And then the ship's lights flickered back to life. They weren't in normal space anymore. The bridge was eerily silent, the crew frozen in place. Marquez clutched her console, her breathing ragged. Locke wiped cold sweat from his forehead. No one spoke. No one moved. Outside the viewport, the rift had changed. The swirling mass of darkness was no longer a vast, distant wound in space. Now it surrounded them, pressing in like a living thing. And beyond it, Cade's breath hitched. They were inside something. Titanic walls of obsidian metal stretched out in every direction, forming impossible structures that defied logic. They pulsed with a sickly, shifting light, neither machine nor flesh. It was an architecture that no known species could have built, because no sane mind could have imagined it. And at the center of it all was the core. A monolith that pulsed like a heartbeat, black veins of shifting energy threading through the massive structure. It was incomprehensibly large, stretching beyond their ability to measure. And it was alive. A tremor ran through the ship. "Captain," Marquez's voice was barely above a whisper, "I think it's talking to us." Cade turned to her. "How?" She gestured to her screen, where indecipherable symbols flashed in rapid succession. "I don't know. I don't even know if this is a language, but I feel it, like it's pressing into my thoughts." Davis let out a breath, a deep, hollow sound. "It speaks in the ways your kind cannot yet understand." Cade turned sharply. "And you can?" Davis didn't answer immediately. His face was pale, his posture unnervingly still. The thing inside him was watching, calculating. Then, without warning, the ship moved. Not by thrusters, not by any force they could measure. It was dragged forward, deeper into the core's labyrinth. "Locke," Cade barked. "Can you override it?" Locke was already working furiously, but his expression told Cade everything. "Nothing, sir. I might as well be pressing buttons on a brick." The monolith loomed ever closer. And then, a sudden jolt. Every screen flickered, showing something new. Not data, not static. A vision. The bridge vanished. For a brief moment, Cade wasn't standing on the Resolute anymore. He was somewhere else. A battlefield. An impossible war, stretching across a sky that wasn't a sky at all. Twisting, burning, filled with the wreckage of civilizations he didn't recognize. Cities turned to ash. Planets split open like wounds. Stars collapsed into screaming voids. And in the heart of it, the core, or something like it, he saw them. The first ones. Not like Davis, not possessed. Something worse. They weren't piloting the rift's power. They had become it. Weapons made from flesh and thought. War forms sculpted from the essence of dead worlds, soldiers reforged into monsters. The rift had not just been a battlefield. It had been a forge. A war machine designed to take the strongest, the most ruthless, and reshape them into something beyond mortality. And it had failed. The last remnants of that ancient war had locked it away, sealing it beyond the edge of the galaxy. The ones who had sent the warning had fought to keep it buried. But now, the Resolute had answered the call. Cade gasped, stumbling back as the vision ripped away, reality slamming back into place. His head pounded. His skin was ice cold. He wasn't the only one. The entire bridge crew was shaking, sweat beading on their faces. Locke was the first to break the silence. What the fuck was that?" Davis exhaled slowly. "Memory." Cade's pulse thundered in his ears. "That's what this is. That's why we were called here." Marquez's voice was hoarse. "It wants to make us like them." Davis nodded once. "And now you understand why you were chosen." The ship trembled again. On the view screen, the monolith's pulsing veins of energy brightened, flowing toward the ship like tendrils, reaching, seeking, testing. Cade gritted his teeth. He knew what came next, a choice, a test of will. He could feel it, the weight of the rift pressing into his thoughts, searching for something. He knew without a doubt that if he let it in, if he accepted what it offered, he would become something else, something more, something less human, and he had no idea if he would ever come back. Davis watched him carefully. This is where you decide. The rift pulsed again, and it waited. The Resolute hung in the abyss, cradled in the grip of something that should never have existed. The rift pulsed, patient, expectant. It wasn't just holding them. It was offering something. A trade. Cade could feel it, pressing against the edges of his mind. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was instinct, knowledge bleeding into his thoughts like ink in water. The rift wasn't a mindless force. It was sentient, and it was waiting for him to answer. The crew's breathing was ragged, too many of them still reeling from the vision. Locke looked sick. Marquez's hands were shaking against her console. But Davis stood at ease, watching Cade with those abyssal eyes. Not quite smiling, not quite human. You know what it wants. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something eager. Cade tightened his jaw. Yeah, he said. I do. The rift wasn't a prison anymore. Not exactly. It was a forge, a crucible that had been waiting for the right material. And now it had Deathworlders. Cade could feel it testing him, brushing against his thoughts like unseen fingers, feeling for the edges of his will. It wasn't speaking to him so much as examining him. Was he worthy? Could he survive the transformation? The thought made his blood run cold, because deep down he knew, if he said yes, if he let the rift take him, he wouldn't be the first. He would be the next. He forced himself to tear his gaze away from the pulsing monolith, looking instead at his crew, the people who had followed him to the edge of the known universe, who had trusted him to bring them home. Marquez swallowed hard. Captain, we can't let it in. Locke's voice was hoarse. If we say yes, we're dead. No, we're worse than dead. Cade didn't disagree, but he could feel the weight of it, the truth. If they rejected the rift, it wouldn't just let them go. It had waited too long. It had chosen them. Davis cocked his head, blackened eyes gleaming. You still believe you have a choice. Cade raised his gun. You still believe you're in control. Davis exhaled a quiet laugh. You misunderstand. The rift does not force. It offers. It gifts. It evolves. Cade's grip tightened. And what the hell did it do to you? Davis's expression didn't change. It showed me the truth. His voice was almost reverent. Cade had seen men break under war. He had seen soldiers lose themselves to fear, to the horrors of battle. Davis hadn't broken. He had surrendered. The rift pulsed again, and suddenly Cade wasn't on the bridge anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere inside it. He stood in an endless void, weightless, surrounded by shifting shadows. Shapes moved in the dark, too fast to see, too slow to be real. And then something spoke, not in words, not in sound, but in understanding. A voice inside his skull, in the deepest part of him, whispering in a language older than time. You are strong. A cold shudder ran down his spine. But you are not complete. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around him, threading into his veins, his bones, his thoughts. And suddenly, he understood. The rift hadn't been a battlefield. It hadn't even been a weapon. It had been a proving ground. A place where warriors had been forged, where the strongest were reshaped into something more. But not just anyone. only those who survived. Cade gritted his teeth, every instinct screaming at him to fight back, to resist. But the rift wasn't an enemy in the way he knew. It wasn't attacking him. It was offering him a choice, a chance to become something beyond human, beyond Deathworlder. And for a moment, just a moment, he was tempted. Because what if they weren't enough? What if they couldn't win? What if this was the only way? His pulse thundered in his ears. And then he thought of his crew, of Marquez, terrified but unbroken, of Locke, gripping his console like a lifeline, of the men and women who had trusted him to get them home. They weren't meant to die in this place. They weren't meant to become this place. Cade's eyes snapped open, and he rejected the rift. The shadows recoiled violently, the whispering voices twisting into an agonized screech. And then, he was back. The bridge snapped into focus, the monolith still pulsing beyond the viewport. His body ached, his mind throbbed, but he was himself. And the rift knew it had failed. The walls of the abyss trembled. The ship shuddered violently, alarms blaring, every screen flickering with unreadable warnings. Locke swore. "Captain, I know," Cade barked. The rift wasn't letting them go. If it couldn't convert them, it would consume them. Cade spun toward Marquez. "Find me a way out. Now." She didn't hesitate, hands flying over her console. "There's a gap in the gravitational field. We can break free if we overload the core." "That'll fry our engines," Locke snapped. "It's that or die here," Cade shot back. Locke hesitated, then cursed. "Fine. Doing it." The rift howled. The monolith's veins of energy surged forward, reaching for them. And the Resolute fired every ounce of power it had. The ship screamed through the rift, engines burning, tearing free from the crushing grip of an ancient, hungry force. The monolith twisted, shifted, and then the Resolute broke through. The rift vanished behind them. The darkness collapsed inward, and suddenly they were back. Normal space. The Resolute drifted, engines dead, power flickering. But they were alive. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Locke let out a ragged laugh. "Holy fuck!" Marquez slumped against her console. Did we win?" Cade exhaled slowly, and then he turned to Davis. The possessed man still stood there, watching. But his blackened eyes, they weren't watching with anger or defeat. They were watching with patience, like he already knew something they didn't. And then, softly, he smiled. "You never escaped." A cold chill ran down Cade's spine. The rift was gone. But something had come with them. And it was waiting. Waiting for the right moment, waiting for the next choice, and deep down, Cade knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot.